Dear listeners, once again I welcome us to this platform. Our topic for this week is the extent of separation of powers, checks and balances under presidential and parliamentary system of government. Now, separation of powers in the parliamentary system of government. Number one, there is fusion rather than separation of powers between the executive and legislature in the parliamentary system. Two, there is overlapping of functions and responsibilities among all the three arms of government. Three, ministers in parliamentary system belong to both the executive and the legislative organs of government. The executive organ tends to have control of the legislative organ, even the judiciary. The head of the judicial organ in Britain that practice the cabinet system is also a member of the two organs, that is the executive and the legislature. The executive is collectively responsible to the parliament for its actions. Now, in parliamentary system of government, there is a fusion of powers between legislative and the executive, that is, legislative and executive branches are intermingled, which are chosen by the legislation. That is, this parliament is sovereign and executive authority is exercised by the minister and cabinet, which drive the legislation, which is driven by the legislation or which is derived from the legislation. In parliamentary system of government, the head of parliament, that is the head of the parliament government, is chosen by the legislative branch and hold the title of the prime minister, as in the case in the United Kingdom and that of Canada. Now, let's look at the separation of powers in the presidential system of government. Under presidential system of government, there is no fusion of powers between the legislatures in the presidential system of government. The two organs are separated both in functions and membership. Two, ministers do not belong to both organs. Any legislator appointed a minister must resign as a member of legislature in which he was elected. 3. The legislature and the judiciary are not controlled by the executive. The president is elected, not appointed, from the parliament and therefore not controlled by the parliament. The chief justice, who is the head of the judiciary, is not a member of the other two arms of government. The executive is not collectively responsible to the parliament for its action. There is no collective responsibility but individual responsibility. Now, in presidential system of government, that is, in presidential, political and administrative powers are divided between the executive, legislature and the judicial branches. In this case, in presidential system, the president, who is the chief executive as the symbolic head of government, is chosen by separate election from that of legislature. That is, the president is elected directly by the people and answerable to the voters. Now, let's look at the checks and balances in a cabinet, that is, in the parliamentary system of government. Number one, in the cabinet system of government, the various arms of government checks and balance one another. That is, we can see the illustration from the cabinet system of government in Britain, which includes the following. That is, number one, the members of the executive, who are also members of the legislature, control the legislative debates by providing the timetable, the procedure, and the activities of the legislation. 2. The legislation and the executive can institute an action on the removal of any judge. 3. The executive can invoke the prerogative of mercy in granting pardon to a convict, thus setting aside a judicial decision. The judiciary has the power to institute a judicial review of any administrative action. Through such review, in action of the executive or the legislation may be declared ultra vile. So what we are saying is this: in presidential, a system of government, in parliamentary system of government, the checks and balances in between the three, there's a checks and balances among the three arms of government. Now let's look at checks on the executive. Number one, any bill initiated by the executive has to be approved by the legislature before the bill can become a law. An important example is the appropriation bill. 2. The chief executive can be impeached by the legislature through an impeachment process laid down in the Constitution. 3. All major appointments by the executive will need legislative approval before such appointment can be effective. 4. Treaty entered into by the executive, that is, we are talking about agreement, have to be approved by the legislature before such treaty or agreement can be binding on the country. So in the parliamentary system of government, there is checks and balances among the three arms of government. Let's look at the checks on the judiciary now. The legislature or the executive can initiate actions which, is successful, may remove a judge from office. 2. A person convicted by the highest court of the land may be pardoned by the chief executive. The power to pardon convict is known as prerogative of mercy, and it is executive checks on the judiciary. So these are the the kind of relationship based on the checks and balances that exist among the three arms of government, how they exercises their power over one another. Now, our questions for this week is: we are going to explain the term separation of powers, checks and balances. We are going to outline the relationship between the two terms above. 3. We are going to define separation of powers. So this brings us to the end of this class for this week. Thank you.